One of life's valuable lessons for me came in an archery class that I took in undergraduate school. Once I had mastered the stance in holding the bow, my foot position, elbow turned outward to avoid the snap of the string, and the placement of the arrow on the bow so that the feathers glide by as you launch the arrow, you would think that I would be able to hit that big old target with those huge circles in it that we call a bullseye. Not. Well, eventually I was able to start hitting the outer rings, but I seemed never to be able to hit that bullseye, the black one in the middle. That is, until I learned to use a sewing pin to adjust my sight for my bow. The lesson, how to keep my sights adjusted on my target. This is an underlying lesson about this morning's parable that Jesus is sharing with his disciples. As we read through Jesus' separating the sheep and the goats, it is very easy for us to place a value judgment on those two groups. The sheep being the good guys, and of course the goats being the bad guys. We then can easily rationalize that we are all sheep and not goats, because we, of course, are good people, not bad people. But I'm not going to let us off the hook that easy. I think this morning's parable is focusing more on our awareness and actions of that awareness, not about being good or bad. The secret of this parable is in the same statement made by both the sheep and the goats. Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty and give you food and something to drink? When did we see you with no place to stay and invite you in? When did we see you poorly dressed and covered you? When did we see you sick and tenderly care for you, or in prison and visit you? Neither the sheep nor the goats were aware of what they normally do as doing it directly to Jesus. Both groups were reacting to situations with other people in a way that was natural to their understanding of God's requirements. As Beverly Zink Sawyer, who is Professor Emeritus of Preaching and Worship at Union Presbyterian Seminary, puts it, the ones on the right side of Jesus respond to the needs of others because they know no other way to respond to God's amazing love. Now, our own UCC Catherine Matthews, who writes with the Sermon Seeds Weekly, points out, a world as spiritually hungry as ours longs to experience that amazing love, and yet we seem not to notice the ways that love reaches out to us. Theologian Richard Swanson finds that love in everyday experience if we live in the expectation that moments of random encounter with people in need are moments illuminated by eternity. The goats in this parable were most likely of the privileged class of their day, or those who at least lived in what would be called acceptable standards of living. For the goat, then, the biggest stumbling block is in their privilege, or of being a part of the norm of what I would call polite society. It isn't that they were doing anything that would be overtly sinful in their living aspects, such as murder or any other thou shalt not of the commandments. The problem with living in the norm is you are not challenged to see what is going on outside of the norm, outside of the circle. What if we put ourselves in the place of those who are hurting, or lonely, or confused, or hungry, or maybe think of our loved ones in need? Would that invoke compassion in our hearts? In spiritual practice, Jesus was a good and faithful Jew, observing the tradition and laws of his faith, which provided for the care of those who were suffering or in need. Today's parable is clearly a "this is what happens at Judgment Day" story. Many of us might look at this morning's lesson as applying only on a personal level, and yet the language "and all the nations will be gathered together before him" tell us that we are talking about the actions and responsibilities at a community and world level. President of Berkeley School of Theology, James Brennan, wrote in Christian Century, calling this teaching crucial to our national health. Crucial to our national health. Jesus is fundamentally interested in systemic institutional commitment to the stranger, and he commands whole nations to treat those on the margins of life with dignity and love. How we as a nation help those who are poor, infirm, imprisoned, or otherwise estranged determines what our ultimate judgment will be. Whom do we push or allow to be pushed to the margins of our shared life, assigning them by default a place of deprivation when it comes to education, safety, food and shelter, health care, even in dignity and security, the goods of life? Catherine Matthews states, if we have enough or more than enough of these goods, are we noticing those who do not? And are we putting our energies and attention towards making this imbalance right? Are we using whatever advantage we have in wealth, in voice, in power, in security, to advance the well-being of others without those advantages? Today's reading makes it clear that what Jesus thinks about these questions and our answers to them. That's where this morning's text challenges us. Not to define ourselves as faithful simply because we go to church or pray or occasionally make a contribution to a worthy cause or volunteer some of our time to help others. The words of Jesus illustrate true religion that transforms our lives, opening our eyes to encounter the sacred in our everyday lives, including the sacred within our most unexpected brothers and sisters. As we find new ways in celebrating this coming Thanksgiving, let us also find ways in which to keep our hearts on finding the mark of God's love. Amen.